Don't feel like you got to have a pure handle on this right off the bat. What I'm going to be showing you is essentially color grading. That the files I sent you earlier today, there were two files. One was the handout. The other was a clip called "Woman to Correct." Pull this clip in. So I'm going to change to the color grading workspace. It's called Color. So in the Color workspace window, go ahead and import the Woman to Correct clip. Drag that and drop that onto your timeline to create a sequence. We'll call that sequence Color Grading Lesson, something like that. And if you look at this clip, the contrast is a little washed out. The color's a little bit green, just not a very good looking clip in terms of its exposure and could use some work. And that's what we're going to be doing with color grading. And so the three things we're working on are contrast. The second thing we're working on is white balance, or the essential is the colors cast, the sort of the presence of the main light source, which in most cases for outdoor footage would be the sun, or if you're indoors, it would be a lamp or overhead lights. Is that balance natural? Does it look normal to the eye? And then the third thing we're trying to work on is essentially skin tones. Kind of a little quick aside on skin tones. It doesn't matter what race the person is. It doesn't matter really what shade of skin we have as a person. What these scopes is essentially, the scopes are looking for, and this is weird, but it's true. The scopes are looking for the color of blood. So everybody shares the same color of blood. If you cut us, and as I know that's that sort of racial reconciliation slogan, we all bleed the same. And that's true. And what that does is essentially underneath the surface of our skin, we have blood and melanin, which are essential ingredients for the coloring of our skin. Everybody's skin, whether you're Asian, Caucasian, African American, whatever your color tone is, it's ultimately going to have a red base or a red value to it. And that's when we start dialing in these scopes, we're looking to get that red value proper. So I'll show you how that works. And it's really kind of a fascinating thing that we can all share a same base color, with the difference basically being the relative amount of melanin in the body. Okay, so first thing I want to do with this clip in particular is I want to get in here and try to get the contrast values into a more normal range. So what I'm going to be doing in order to do that is I'm going to be opening these Lumetri scopes. And this is what I was having problems with earlier, guys. So I apologize if there's some lag time between what I'm trying to do. I don't know what's going on with Premiere, but it's been a little bit uncooperative. Sometimes I think when I'm sharing my screen and working with Zoom, it takes some resources away from me. But anyway, you go here to this wrench. I'm going to read from the handout. So I can remember to do things properly, but also so when you guys get ready to do this yourself, you'll be able to follow along. I think I'm going to make this an assignment. We're not going to have time to do it today, and I'm not sure it's a good use of time to do it in class. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this an exercise. I will record this segment, put it on Sakai, and have you guys turn that in as part of one of your exercises. And I'm going to push back the due date on the After Effects thing to allow time for you to do this. The more I'm thinking about it, I think color grading is super important. So I want you guys to have a handle on that before we get too far into After Effects. Okay, so we've already started our timeline. We've got our color workspace. And now what I want to do is I want to get into the Lumetri scopes here. And in order to do that, I want to open up this panel. So if I'm looking at my source clips, my effects controls, my clip mixer, it's the Lumetri scopes panel right here. And what you're seeing when you click on this tab, what I'm showing you right now is what's called a vectorscope. This dates back to kind of the early days of analog videography and even cinematography, where there are devices called a Lumetri scope, called a vectorscope. It's actually a machine that you would plug a feed from a camera directly into this machine, and it would have a screen very similar to the one that's appearing here in Premiere that would show you the values of your RGB and those associated colors, as well as the brightness values. And you would use that device to calibrate your your cameras on location. Nobody really uses that stuff anymore. Nowadays, we have digital devices that allow us to do those things in camera. But back in the day, it was a separate machine called a vectorscope that we'd use for that. Now, under here, under the vectorscope, in the Lumetri Scopes panel, there's a little wrench here. And this wrench gives you the option to turn on or off different kinds of scopes for the purposes of color grading. The only ones that we're concerned with right now, because we're working on contrast, is the Luma waveform. So I'm going to, if you see that, I can click the wrench and I can uncheck the ones I don't want to use. So this is the one I want, which is the Luma waveform. You remember back when we were doing some of those transition effects, we had the Luma, what do you call it? When I was doing those Luma transitions with you, I can't think of the name of that effect, but Luma meaning luminance. It's kind of a shorthand for luminance. It may even be like a Latin term, but we're essentially going to try to dial in the luminance of this clip in order to make our whites look as white as they should be and our blacks look as black as they should be and have a nice range in between. So the way we do that is we go in here and use this Luma waveform scope to take care of that. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go over here to the Lumetri color panel. If you remember, the Lumetri color is an effect you can apply to your clips. If you're in the color grading window and you go and start manipulating any of these Lumetri color effects, it will automatically drop that effect in onto your clip. So the one I want to work with here, I'm going to select this Woman to Correct clip. I've got my Luma waveform scope open, and I've got under the different panel options, there's a tab here called Curves. So let me show you. If I go here to Curves, there is the first of these effects to manipulate is called RGB curves. That's the one we want to work with, and essentially that will give us the option to change the whiteness and blackness values. And the way you do that is you open up the RGB curves, and if you see here, there are 4 dots. There's a white, a red, a green, and blue. So you've got white, which is luminance, and then RGB, red, green, blue. The one we're worried with for contrast is the white value. And what I'm going to do is, if you look real closely, it's going to be a little hard to see, but in the upper right corner, there's a little button. I mean, a little pinpoint that you can drag, and you can move that around inside this window across the XY values. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be looking in the scope here on the left. If you see right now, this clip is underexposed it's underexposed in the black values and a little bit underexposed in the white values as well. So by looking at this scope here on the left part of the screen, I can see that my top end white values are only peaking at 90. Hopefully you guys can see that. Let me make this a little bit larger so you can see what I'm talking about. So right here, my white values are peaking at 90. My black values are only going as low as 20. What my goal is to try to get all these sort of gray elements. You can watch, this is sort of, if I just scrub through the clip, this is the color information, I mean, the luminance information in that scope. What I want to try to do is I want to get the blacks all the way down here to 0, and I want to get the whites all the way up to 100. And the way that I do that is I take this adjustment in the RGB curves and I drag it. So if you see here, I'm dragging the white, the very top end, that most of the luminance is at the top end. I'm dragging that and I'm hitting 100%. Now, when I keep dragging it, it starts going past the point of no return. It only gets to 100, and then there's sort of a drop off. So you want to kind of approximate 100 without going too far over it. So you can see as I'm dragging this around, not only is the image on the right changing, but the scope is changing as well. So I'm gonna try to get to that point of just under 100 where it starts to break. And that's where I want to live with my white values. Down here at the bottom is my black values. I'm going to do the same thing. The goal is to bring this down. So the lowest part of this scope wave is down here at around 0. So watch me as I drag this to the right and see what's happening here in the picture. So essentially what's happening in the picture, by having kind of change the contrast ratio on that and getting more in line with what the scope is telling me that we need, we've brought this clip into kind of a more natural contrast range. We've got kind of nice dark blacks with still a little bit of detail in there. And up in the white areas, we've got a nice, bright white, which is where we want to be. And I couldn't, if my monitor was not calibrated properly, I might be looking at this image without scopes and say, it looks pretty good. But by looking at the scopes here, I know it's actually accurately good. So that's what we're doing. We've essentially gone here to RGB curves using our wave Luma scope, dragged that white value in a little bit at the top right and over a little bit on the top, on the bottom right, to get a full range of contrast from the whitest whites all the way to the blackest blacks. And the goal is to try to make that wave in that scope go from 0 to 100 and fill that area with a result. All right. So that's the first thing we want to do in terms of making this clip look as good as possible, is adjusting the contrast. We've done that with the waveform scope. So the next thing I want to do is I want to use the Luma waveform I'm going to use the color panel curves to bring the color more into an accurate space. Right now it's a little bit green, doesn't quite look quite right. So I'm going to the Lumetri color panel and choose RGB curves. I fix that. I want to read the RGB parade and Vectorscope YUV for white balance. So I'm going to turn off the waveform Luma, turn on parade. So now I have two scopes on the screen. The one on the left is called the RGB parade, and the one on the right here is the Vectorscope. And what I'm doing in this case is trying to get a similar result to what we had going on with our Luma wave. If you can see here, the RGB values are a little bit out of whack. We don't have quite as much blue as we need. Red and green and blue are all a little bit low. So what I'm going to do to adjust those is I'm going to, using my RGB parade, let me make sure I'm telling you guys how to do this properly. Now I'm going to go to my basic correction tab up here. I'm going to pull back my WB selector, which is the white balance selector. It's this little element here, and I'm going to pick a little piece of white somewhere. Probably the best, most accurate piece of white I can see is this down here on our leg. And you can see what we're seeing now by selecting white is I see that there's the red, green, and blue values are all out of whack, and I want to be able to adjust those to get into a more proper looking video. So I'm going to go here back to my curves, and I'm going to try to do the same thing with each of the green and red values, try to get them to fit more in line with where they need to be. So we don't have a lot to work with on green. That's probably about as good as we're going to get. We have a lot of green already in this shot, so we want to. Blue is where our real problems are, so let me see what I can do to increase the amount of blue in the shot. We need to add a little bit of red at the bottom end. It's a little bit closer to real, to normal. It's still a little bit green on the screen. And one of the things I can see here in the Vectorscope is that the flesh tones are a little bit off. So let me show you what we need to do. We need to adjust the hue, not just the amount of hue. I need to actually adjust the range of hue that's available to manipulate in this shot. So next thing we want to do is we want to essentially try to dial in our skin tones. I think we've got a pretty good range of brightness values, contrast, and then we've got according to our scopes, RGB are fairly close to where they need to be. But we've sort of reached the maximum we can do by using the curve. So we need to find another tool to get us closer. So this time I'm no longer interested in using the parade. I've used my RGB parade. What I do want to add on the screen would be just basically this vector scope. And that's going to give me an opportunity to dial in my skin tones. So I'm going to go back over to my effects controls, and I'm going to take a little piece of this lady's skin. I'm going to highlight it. So this is the only thing that the scope is going to evaluate. Oops, I hit the wrong thing. Sorry, guys. I need to mask the whole clip. So I only want the scope to read that piece of skin. I don't want the sky. I don't want the grass. I just want to be able to evaluate and modify the skin tone itself. So that's why I built this little, basically masked out everything but her skin on her face. So I'm going to go back to my Lumetri color here, and I'm going to begin manipulating that according to my scopes to try to bring the red and yellow values into harmony with what the scope tells us is accurate skin tone. If you're looking at a Lumetri scope, there's a line that essentially is at the 10 o'clock, 10:30 mark. So it's essentially what I would call northwest, pointing northwest on the compass. Probably see that. Probably see the line right there. It goes right, kind of upper left down here to the middle. And what I want to try to do is I want to get this little smudge that's over here. This little, if you see me kind of moving through the clip, that smudge is her skin tone. That's what's being monitored here on this scope. And I want to try to get that to dial in and line up with that, that element here. Let me show you what it should look like. Can you guys see that image I just dragged into my screen, or is it still showing you Premiere? You can see it? Okay, this is what we're going for. We're trying to get this little kind of luminant smudge to line up with that northwest arrow. And the way we want to do that is we have to use a thing that's called hue versus hue. So opening this color correction effect, I'm going down to the second box here. It's called hue versus hue. And if you drag, I need to click on the clip itself. And I can essentially click on the hue versus hue, and I can move that little dot around. If you see, when you click on it, you're adding a vertical line as well as the horizontal line. And just by moving that around and aiming to line up that smudge with that northwest line, I'm dialing in the skin tone into a more normal range. So let me go ahead and turn off that opacity mask and show you where we ended up. Okay, let me show you what it looked like before. That was the original clip. Here's what it looks like now. Is that more normal? Does that look more like a regular person sitting outside with normal skin tones? I think it does. And the scopes tell us that it does. So just to essentially what we've done is we've applied a variety of color correction effects using the scopes as our monitor to make sure that we're doing things accurately, not just using our eyesight. And we've created a color grade for her skin tone in this outdoor setting by adjusting the luminance values in the RGB curves. That was the white value here. We've also adjusted individually the red, green, and blue values, and according to our RGB parade scope, we brought them all into effect. This is what I was talking about earlier about how my scopes are being slow to appear. So we've added the RGB parade, we have our vector scope, and we have our luminance, our Luma wave scope, all at a harmonious level to achieve this end product of a well-balanced, well-exposed, attractive shot that we can then use in our work. If I wanted to take that color correction and bring that back and use that repeatedly, let's say we shot a whole scene with this lady out by this waterfront, and we had a bunch of shots that were poorly exposed and weren't quite the right color. I can take this Lumetri color effect that we've just so painstakingly created, and I can save it as a preset. I can call it, let's say her name was Judy. I could call this, Judy Glut or Judy Skin or whatever I wanted to call it. And then I could use that anytime this shot of Judy outside popped up into our project. I could just drag that effect from my presets onto those clips, and it would give me a good starting point. It might not be perfect because obviously Judy's going to be in different places. There may be other objects in the scene that might affect the color. She may be turning away from the sun, or cloud cover may cover the sun, but at least you've got a good starting point. And if you're working inside a studio setting where there aren't a lot of changes, you're going to be pretty close to accurate every time you use that preset, given those specific parameters that you're working with. Okay, I know I threw a lot of stuff at you. That was a pretty overwhelming for some of us. I know that color grading can be an overwhelming process. There are people in Hollywood, all they do all day long is color grade footage. And they've become masters of using these scopes in order to achieve these kind of looks. So I don't expect you guys to become masters of it right away, but these are some nice tools and some fairly easy ways to take bad footage or even mediocre footage and make it look as good as possible. If I wanted to then sort of highlight this a little bit further, there's some other things that you can do. There's some creative tools built into Premiere. If you look at this creative tool, there are some default LUTs, which I'm just cycling through real quick under the creative tool. These are actually saved preset, color grade presets that go with different kinds of cameras. You can also import your own LUTs for depending on cameras and looks and types of film stock and things like that. If you're working in Hollywood and you're using a specific Fuji film stock, you can pick the Fuji LUT and automatically apply that. In this case, we don't want to do any of that stuff, so I'm going to go none. But I can also add things like vibrance. If I want to make that a little bit more of a richer color, I could drag this vibrance selection up. If I want it to be more of a saturated look, there's some other options there by adding saturation. If I wanted it to sort of have a faded film quality, you can kind of pull back. So you've got these nice little creative mechanisms that you can plug around and play with in order to get those different effects you're looking for. But in this case, I want to reset everything back to the default because I don't want that. I want to look more naturalistic. Okay, so that's color grading. There's a lot of stuff that we can do with color grading to improve our footage. It's a challenge to learn, but at least with this reference sheet, you can get started and go through and do what you need to do to adjust some pretty bad footage.